and welcome to Planet Poetry. My name's Robin Houghton.
And I'm Peter Kenny. And in this episode we talk to Paul Stephenson about his long-awaited first full collection, the excellently named Hard Drive.
And Peter and I have been reading Janet Sutherland's fifth full collection from Shearsman, The Messenger House. Is it poetry? Is it a memoir? Is it travelogue? Or is it, a new word I've just been taught by Peter, prosimetrum? Are you going to tell us what that means at some point?
Yes, all shall be revealed later.
Excellent. And Peter's been reading Charlotte Gann's latest pamphlet as well.
But before all those wonders, let's hear what Paul Stephenson had to say to Robin.
Paul Stephenson studied modern languages and linguistics and has an MA in creative writing from the Manchester Writing School. He's published 3 pamphlets: Those People, Smith Doorstop 2015, which won the Poetry Business Pamphlet Competition, The Days That Followed Paris from Happenstance in 2016, and Selfie with Water Lilies from Paper Swans Press in 2017. In 2018, he co-edited the Europe issue of Magma, and currently he's the co-curator of Poetry in Aldborough. He is a university teacher and researcher and lives between Cambridge and Brussels. His debut collection, Hard Drive, was published by Carcanet in 2023. Paul Stephenson, welcome to Planet Poetry.
Morning, Robin. Great to be here.
And tell us, where are you speaking to us from?
I'm sitting at home today in my apartment in Brussels.
Are you based there all the time, or you sort of flit to and fro with the UK?
I flit back and forth between Brussels, London and Cambridge. I was in London just on Wednesday for a poetry reading at the Betsy Trotwood.
A classic venue, isn't it? Very poetry friendly. So this morning we are here to talk about your latest book, your first full collection. I was surprised to hear it was your first collection, but this is it, from Carcanet, Hard Drive. It's a big book, isn't it? 120 pages. And I just have to say that I read it from front to back in one sitting, which is highly unusual for me. I think the last time that happened was Ilya Kaminsky's Deaf Republic. So what I'd like you to do is perhaps read the opening poem, Anglepoise.
Anglepoise. You'll be in the front room at your computer, surrounded by your family of Anglepoise lamps. The novel will be making steady progress. I'll be in the kitchen with my laptop and radio, editing some poem or other, devoting an hour to the question of a comma, semicolon, full stop. Voices will drift up to me from where you are. My drama will drift down the hallway to you. There'll be hot radiators and rugs, curtains drawn. We'll both be home, absorbed in our projects, each working our way through the bottle of red. I'll be alive, you'll be alive. It'll be like old times.
This feels like the perfect opener. Even from the title, Anglepoise, we have this sense of something beautiful and classic and functional, and it endures forever. And even the word poise in the title, we're poised for something to happen. That's what it feels like. And we have this last 2 lines, which feels like a punch. You know, something is going to happen, and this beautiful, idyllic scene is going to be fractured. And I love the way that there are details in here that come through the book later on. We hear more about the rug, or being in the kitchen and editing and being one end of the flat to the other. So it's a beautiful precursor to what's to come, isn't it? Because this book is in fact about the untimely death of your partner, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a preface poem that kind of encapsulates the whole book. It sets up what's to come. I did actually consider calling the book Anglepoise, but in the end I thought Hard Drive was had many more interpretations, and perhaps the word Anglepoise was in itself a little too poetic.
So we're set up for this sequence of poems. I noticed that it's in, is it 5 or 6 sections, which seem to follow this, the Kubler-Ross grief curve from anger and denial through to acceptance. Is that too obvious to mention that?
Well, it's really interesting that you mention it. I mean, I wasn't aware of what I was doing, but perhaps implicitly, subconsciously, I have, covered all of these stages of grief and bereavement throughout the book. Not necessarily in that order, but certainly the first 3 of the 6 sections operates in a sort of linear manner.
Yeah,
dealing with the practicalities of bereavement, the rituals, the performances, the things you have to do.
Yeah.
And reads very much like a novel, I think, in poems.
Yes, yes.
And towards the end of the book, certainly I've moved from anger, there is certainly some angry poems, and denial,
yeah,
towards acceptance. So
the first section, as you mentioned, is dealing with the stuff that has to be done. And I think anyone who has been through these stages, they're instantly recognisable. You don't really say that this person died. It's kind of, we have this tiny 3-line poem which refers to it obliquely, and then we're in the chapel of rest to see him. And I wondered if you might read one of the early poems which covers this episode. I tell him about the people.
I tell him about the people who have been in touch, about his parents, my brother, Mum and Tom, the friends we've not seen in years, the ones we spent good times with, drinking and laughing, gallivanting. I want him to hear how we've been in contact, keen for him to know they're all thinking of him. I need him to learn, one by one, the long list of our life, of all those who love him. In a hushed tone, speaking softly, sorry for my silly embarrassment, paranoid in case someone's there, a mortuary worker listening from behind the curtained backdrop. I stand in the low-ceilinged room and force myself, try to keep it casual, muster words to fill the quiet. I run out of names, exhaust the list, resort to love and apologies.
There's this sense of almost comforting a child, in a hushed tone, isn't there? Speaking softly and sorry for my embarrassment. And I love this word gallivanting. I mean, is that kind of a tiny clue as to what's to come? There's a lot of playfulness in the book, isn't there?
Particularly in the second half of the book, when I go back to revisit the relationship, the first encounter, falling in love, lots of travel, getting up to hijinks, holidays together.
Hence the gallivanting, quite literally, I suppose. I like the way that the poems almost turn surreal in this first section. There's this poem, isn't there, where you're imagining Todd opening his eyes and looking at you, or you're even imagining being on a sort of a TV set. It becomes a game show, and everything is just crazy. That was, I thought, an inspired way of describing perhaps that sense of it not being real.
Yeah, it's the disbelief, trying to capture the complete disbelief of the situation. And it did feel like a theatre stage, seeing a body lying there on display, and thought, is this candid camera?
Yeah.
Is this really happening?
Yeah.
I wrote that poem, the 2 poems actually, Not Dead and Masterpiece Theatre. They were one poem originally, and I wrote the poem actually on a poetry school course with Will Harris, where we were asked to tell a lie. So I thought, what's the biggest lie I can tell?
Oh gosh, that's interesting. Huh. This all happened in 2016. I wanted to ask you whether it takes a while for you to process events in order to write about them.
Yeah, I don't think these poems emerged immediately afterwards, probably a couple of years later. I think we're all doing a lot of writing in our head, aren't we, and processing, and the poems are sort of marinating, perhaps, before we actually write them.
Yes. So you didn't write these poems straight after these of this, like 5 years of work? Or
Yeah, 6 years of work and 1 year of production and editing, yeah.
I wondered if you could read a prayer for death admin for us, please.
A prayer for death admin. For the message received to establish contact and being the designated representative. For the formal letter of authorization and acting on behalf in matters regarding. For the ample information to take on board and the tissue samples to be carefully taken. approximately the size of a thumbnail, for the detailed microscope examination. For the offer of assistance with all legalities and the certified copies for permanent filing. For the order form attached to be completed and the 10 copies, but more if requested. For the confirmation of cancelled subscription and the £40 refunded to a credit card. For the stop to collection activity on the account and the number to please quote in all correspondence. For the utility companies, E.ON, EDF, First Utility, and their written request for meter readings. For their final statements of accurate usage and music played on hold with Virgin Media. For the clearing of contents, bulk waste collection and the end of tenancy move-out cleaning. For the follow-up note that card transactions will appear on your bank statement as fantastic services. For the automated replies to emails received successfully and passed on to the appropriate council department, for the aim to make things as smooth as possible for you, and the paid-up start date for postal redirection. For the message entitled Death of a Library User and the titles of the 6 books currently issued. For the overdue fines waived, no further fees accruing, and the reassurance not to worry if you can't locate them.
Yeah, it just about sums up all the dreadful, death admin, quite. And you call it a prayer, and it's written in this kind of list format, but it's actually in quatrains, isn't it? This whole book kind of fizzes with form or wizardry. I just wanted to ask you how much you enjoy working with form, and is this something you've always done? Does form come naturally, or do you have to spend a lot of time thinking, this is the wrong form for this poem?
Yeah, I love experimenting with form and obviously being as playful as possible and trying to vary things for me and for the reader. You know, what is the potential of the page? What can a poem look like? Can we find forms that we've never seen before? I really wanted, of course, every poem for the reader to renegotiate their emotional response to the poem, which is why there is a mix of very serious poems and sincere poems, and a mix of absurd and surreal poems. And I think varying the form as well also helps with that and sort of, keeps the reader on their toes.
I wondered if you might read The Button. I think it's a great example of how you're able to employ humour and also be intensely moving, the obsessing over a detail.
The Button. Michael appeared just as he said he would. He issued hushed words with a soft Irish accent, his demeanour tidy, calm, professional, familiar. We had to get going. Someone was after us, so it couldn't run over. Michael just wanted to talk through a few last details, including the button. The button, there next to the wooden lectern. He guided me over. Would you like me to take care of it? Or when we got to the final song, would I be up to it? Could I bring myself to take care of the button? He'd be on hand, standing at the rear of the chapel. Looking back, I don't know how I pushed it, or if he said to push or press or what verb, if the button was green like green for go, green as the pool table lawn, or red as the brick arches and spent roses, or was it black? Why did I push it? Push because I was a crazed control freak, that July Tuesday, me playing at Master of Ceremonies? Or was it out of duty? The button, I mean. For it was silly, like an Amtram prop. Though the button was small, it was also violent. And oh, I shouldn't have been allowed to make a person disappear with such a tiny weapon. Oh, it was horrid in its automation, melodramatic and almost camp. Yes, that's it. It was camp. Vulgar and hammed up, a tasteless step, banal, extravagant. Which was apt in an affected sort of way, because T would likely have pressed it himself, acting out a theatrical ruse. It's just, if nobody had pushed the button, the huge curtain wouldn't have wrapped round, and I'd never have caught a corner glance of the doors parting, letting in a sharp slit of white light as he was taken. He'd have lain there, in situ, our modest gathering filing out into the midday sunshine, and I'd be even more a mess, knowing I'd not sent him off completely, Beneath that bed of summer flowers I flung on as they carried him in, a meadow all orange, purple, all yellow.
These are 8-line stanzas, aren't they? So the central of the 4 is the one where you crescendo into this absurd point, and then you come down again in the final section of the poem. I thought it was brilliant. Why did I push it? It almost goes back to the question of why. Why did it happen in the first place, which comes up through the book, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure all crematoria have buttons, but this one in Golders Green certainly did. It was rather old-fashioned, I imagine. I just remember buying this beautiful bouquet of flowers from this florist in Highgate, and then thinking I'm going to, lay this very intricate blanket of flowers on the coffin.
Yeah.
And of course, in the moment, it all happens so quickly. Oh. You have no choice but to just fling the flowers on.
And we're left with the colours of the flowers and orange. Actually, orange, purple and yellow, those colours come up again. These are some of the little details that I really enjoyed.
They do, and this is a poem actually that appeared in Poetry Wales. And Jonathan Edwards was so attentive with this poem as an editor. He insisted on that second appearance of the word all at the end of the poem, which I think, all orange, purple, all yellow.
All yellow, yes. Gosh, isn't it good to have an editor who pays that much attention and pulling out every possible nuance? I noticed also that you use these names through the book. I made a note of some of them. Carol and Jade at Storage Kingdom, and Sarah, who leaves a voicemail that seems to go on ad infinitum. And yet we get very few names of family members or friends, whereas these should be anonymous people get their names.
Yeah.
But on the subject of names, there are 2 poems on Todd's name, aren't there? First of all, your name, and then later on, namesake. So interested that you gave his name 2 different treatments, if you like. Do you want to tell us anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, with the first one, I was exploring the multiple meanings of the word Todd, obviously death in German, but which words contain the words TOD in other languages as well? Obviously, the poem ends also with todos and todas and Spanish. I veer from English and Old Scottish, whatever, to Dutch, to other languages to see where Todd appears. Of course, I see him every day when I have so many thumbnails open on my laptop and I listen to the Today programme. And of course, that gets reduced down on a thumbnail to TOD.
No. Oh, gosh.
He's always there.
Yeah.
Always there on my laptop.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was a sort of exploration of seeing how deep I could mine the name. And then with namesake, I found this text in PN Review by Nicholas Trudell on Todorov, on the Bulgarian philosopher and fiction writer. And I thought perhaps I can further explore Todd through negation by saying who he wasn't.
Yes.
Yes. So use somebody else's biography to say this wasn't Todd.
Very clever.
And eventually, I think I sort of slightly switched towards the end of the poem towards the affirmative and saying, no, Todd was this, Todd was this.
Yeah.
Todorov might have been this, but Todd was this. It's a bit like an erasure in a way, as a formal technique, I suppose. I certainly have found, using somebody else's text as the starting point.
The next poem I was going to ask you to read was the title poem, Hard Drive. It seems to come at a time where, having gone through the period of finding homes for Todd's possessions, putting stuff into storage, and a lot of mention of things, if you like, suddenly the physical things seem to become less important.
Hard drive. Our life is out there, somewhere, on a hard drive, someplace, dark and silent, deep inside. We are saved, we are stored, all we were, us recorded, for the time being ignored. Our love is out there somewhere, love that drove us someplace we didn't know, we hadn't been, safe and secure behind closed doors. All the files in all the folders switched off, put away. I'll get a man to locate our life, to retrieve our life, our love, and transfer it, so I can relive it someday, our life of years, all the days sitting there, unlooked at, us collected.
Us collected, yes. I have to mention again the form of this. There are 2 columns, each of 3 stanzas of 6 lines. So it's got a very square, neat, organised look, like it's a box. It's a box of boxes. Everything's stored. And interestingly, it can be read differently, can't it? One column and then the next column, which gives another kind of nuance to the whole thing.
Yeah, you can read it. You can read it down, or you can read it across. Yeah,
but also being the title poem, it feels like it's there's some kind of linchpin-esque feel to it.
Yeah, so Hard Drive is the title of the book. Hard Drive, in this instance, obviously most obviously refers to computer hard drives, where we keep our files, our photos, our videos, our text files. But Hard Drive itself, I think, has other meanings. The hard drives that I had to do, being chauffeured to the crematorium, to the mortuary.
Yeah.
I think the whole journey of bereavement is a hard drive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even a long-term relationship, the cohabitation, the working hard at something.
It's quite interesting the way that we talk about the cloud as well. I know that's off-piste, but, we assume stuff in the cloud and, where is this bloody cloud?
There is a poem that didn't make it into the book, actually, it's called BC.
Before the cloud.
Before clouds, before clouds. It's published in the Fendon Poetry Journal recently, actually, but didn't put that poem in the book. But yeah, Before Clouds.
You mentioned earlier about a poem that was almost an erasure poem, and we've talked about form, and we've got everything from sonnets to backslashes and lacunae, and there's a couple of poems where you substitute one word for another. I have seen this before. The poem Enter the Gyre, you substitute the word plastic for grief, I think. That's how I read it. Is there a word for that technique where you substitute one word for another in a poem?
I have absolutely no idea. But I found this wonderful text, all about the accumulation of plastics in the ocean. And I thought that's a fantastic metaphor for grief. So I'll try to work with that kind of technical language. I mean, I had to make other changes to the text. But,
yes. Well, I think you need to give it a name.
I'd previously done that in my, I have a poem called Death Flake.
Yes.
Where I play with both the words death and snow. I interchange them. In my pamphlet, I think, in Selfie for Water Lilies.
I think I've seen that. So maybe it's your poems I've seen before that have used this technique. So maybe it is yours and you need to give it a name.
Okay.
One of my favourites is The Hymn of Him, which it's 14 lines and not only formal in its metre and rhyme and its look on the page, but it's got this amazing onomatopoeic sound patterning. And I wondered if you would read this for us, please.
The Hymn of Him. The ap of him, the bop of him, the cap, the cop of him, the cup of him, the dip, the fop of him, the gap of him, the hip, the hop of him, the jip of him, the lap, the lip of him, the map of him, the mop, the nap of him, the nip of him, the pep, the pip of him, the pup of him, the quip, the rap of him, the rep of him, the rip, the sap of him, the sip of him, the sup, the tap of him, the tip of him, the top, the VIP of him, the whip of him, the yap, the yep of him, the zap of him, the zip, the ship of him, the shop of him, the shut up, the chap of him, the chip of him, the chop.
Isn't that wonderful? Listeners, dear listeners, isn't that wonderful? Actually, seeing it on the page while you're reading it is also obviously adds to the enjoyment of it. I read it a couple of times. I thought, oh, this is clever. All these repeated sounds, and then I realised it's an A to Z. It goes from app through bop through cap right down to the zip, and that gave another level of joy to the reading of it. And I guess that's what it's meant to be, is it not? Expressing the joyousness of this person. It is, and trying to find meaning in some of those small words where you wouldn't necessarily think you can make an association. The app of him. Yes. If only there were an app. You can find your own meanings there. I think always choose sound over meaning. Interesting. We'll make our own. Readers make their own meanings. Yeah. Yeah. I like that. I think this is an example of a poem where, constraint
is so useful,
Yes.
to give yourself a constraint and to use a device. And then you can be surprised as a writer, I think. And that using constraint, just using these little 3-letter words, going through the dictionary, creating a word field, and it has a song-like quality as an effect.
I might be at a workshop where they say something like, be inspired by this, use constraints, whatever. And then I might sort of feel, it feels contrived. I'm trying to fit things into a certain box. Is that something that you think we shouldn't worry too much about? Just trust your instincts and just try it. And I don't know what the answer is to that.
I mean, sometimes, the poem can feel like a kind of exercice de style, where we've gone through the motions, and you can see the scaffolding.
Yes.
And there may be no emotional heart to the poem. It's a useful exercise. And that's okay, isn't it, for some poems to just fall flat, to be experiments. But occasionally, one will work. You've
mentioned that sections 4 and 5 are more about your life with Todd and your travels and the things you used to do. Then we all have those moments when, when you've lost someone, a long time later, something pops into your head and, and it sort of brings it back or whatever. There was a poem that comes in that section called I Can Be Happily. So perhaps you'd read it for us now.
I could be happily engrossed in some, have my head stuck in, looking out at noticing the new, admiring the curve of fixed on the weigher, lost in the recent and oblivious too. I can be enjoying a quiet, browsing the latest, choosing between or flicking through, taking in all the catching up on my, touching base with, planning and overdue. I can be peering over at, preparing a small, getting ready for, in the queue, looking forward to when suddenly I, out of nowhere, picture you.
Very beautiful. Thank you. Now, towards the end of the book, there are quite a few, I think you might have mentioned it already, there's quite a few quite angry poems that come in here. And there's one poem when you bring your own name into it, Grief as the Preamble of the Maastricht Treaty. And it's just this amazing, it really does read like a formal treaty with all the capital letters and all the titles laid out. And it's unreadable out loud, I would imagine, really. To get the full effect, you have to see it written down.
Yeah, it's a poem that I'm trying to capture the complete self-indulgence, actually, of grief, because it's very me, an egocentric kind of process, really, isn't it? An experience. And here I am, the Minister for Sadness. I'm also the Minister for Wallowing, the Minister for Excessive Drinking, the Minister for Sleeping In, the Minister for Storage Units. Yeah, it's me.
I thought it was a marvellous way of coming towards the end of the book, although we do finish with a final poem. And I thought it was a wonderful way to end the collection.
Yeah, this is a postscript poem, actually, a poem where I finished the manuscript and I thought I'll end with Grief as the Preamble of the Maastricht Treaty and then have a couple of blank pages. I mean, that's the book done. And then for there to just be this quieter, small surprise poem at the end of the book.
Yeah, lovely.
And I remember writing the poem, and as I was writing it, it was that whole physical experience of the poem happening. It was an exciting feeling, a very physical, sensory experience of having writing by hand a poem. And I kind of knew in the moment, I thought, this is the last poem. This is the last poem. Because it was written quite a few months sort of after really considering that the manuscript was done. And I'd gone down to the middle of rural France to go to the wedding of one of Todd's very good friends. So I was kind of there on his behalf, really.
Yeah.
And I found this gorgeous bed and breakfast, and I was the only guest. Wedding in Limousin. I'm writing this in the swimming pool. In a swimming pool in which I am the only swimmer. I've stopped swimming to write this poem. Here alone, just arrived, my first swim. 3 trains and a taxi, 38 degrees, a June heat wave. Standing here, cooling off, the robot cleaning underwater, almost company. A pen is letting out its ink, a notebook covered in wet patches from my wet arm, right hand. Blotched words. Sun hot on my back, the blanks of paper wrinkling into waves. France. Sound of a tractor, and a moment ago church bells. A breeze, honeysuckle. All this way. I've come to represent you, but I'm also here for me. Hey, a swallow just skimmed the pool, was off again. 6th in a row. A swallow for each year you've been gone. It's time to swim.
Gorgeous. Time to swim, time to let go, time to push off and get on with it. And there's one lovely little kind of Easter egg in there that I noticed, 38 degrees. 38, the age that Todd was. And we've had one poem, Other People That Died aged 38, haven't we? So the number has come up again right at the end.
And it was in June again, yeah.
In June. Well, this is a marvellous book, Paul. Congratulations. It's already into its first reprint, isn't it? So I think it's going to do very well. I shall listen out next year and just see.
Well, thank you so much, Robin. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you today and be part of your Planet Poetry podcast series.
Thanks for coming on again.
Thank you.
You just can't help as a human being to just feel such sympathy for people that have, lost partners. And I think there's such a history of this, like, Douglas Dunn's Elegies that we've talked about on the pod before.
Yeah, and Tennyson, In Memoriam.
Tennyson and so on. And this kind of brings it very much up to date, I think, that sort of tradition.
Yes.
There's something about books about a bereavement that, the emotion is already there. Everybody knows what it's like to be bereaved, or if not, to have lost somebody, or even just a relationship to have broken up traumatically or something.
Yeah.
We've all felt the absence of another person. So in a way, I think that gives you a bit of an advantage when you're writing a book that's about bereavement, because, people already feel that emotional resonance. I found it quite controlled, and you talked about being constrained, but this kind of focus on form, because there's such a fascinating diversity of form in here, that it's almost like he's looking at grief from every possible angle through every formal avenue. You said it was 120 pages long. That's a really detailed look at it from every single angle.
Yes, but it does trace this narrative, I suppose. So in a way, it's not picking at the same scab for 120 pages. So it develops, and we didn't talk much about the second half of the book or the later sections of the book, but I think he does say at one point, doesn't he, that it's as much about the people who are left.
Yeah.
So although the first section does start this sort of semi-surreal, going through the motions of dealing with authority and stuff like that, you're kind of thrown into it. It starts to get more pensive as you move through the book, I think.
Yeah.
There is a strong emphasis on playing with form, and I suppose that is a direct opposite to, say, for example, Tennyson's In Memoriam, where it's like, I forget how many pages long it is, but it's all exactly the same form all the way through, isn't it? You're kind of on this kind of grinding treadmill of grief.
Yeah, I think I'd much rather read Paul's book again than Tennyson's. But there's so much that you can identify with. There's sort of a prayer for death admin. I mean, doing that as a prayer is amazing. But all that sort of way of listing all those interminable, and each one is kind of upsetting in its own way if you let it be. And, listening to Virgin's hold music and so on. Just those little details. Absolutely,
yeah. There's another one in that sort of vein called Voicemail, where it's Sarah is away next week, so would like to speak to me today if it's convenient, if it's not too much trouble. And it goes on and on and on. This is long voicemail, some official tiptoeing around the issue. There were many very moving moments and very intense moments in the book. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah.
Certainly, Paul, he loves experimenting with form, and anyone who is intrigued by that and is excited by that as well will love this book.
I mean, a poem like I Can Be Happily, I think that was a really good way of talking about that nagging sense of how you can be going around about your normal business, and yet that kind of sense of something being terribly wrong in the background keeps kind of interrupting and jolting you. And there's always something missing in this poem, isn't it? Engrossed in some, have my head stuck in, looking out of noticing the new, nothing's complete because it's always interrupted. So I think that works extremely well. He's got an idea about how to progress with it, and he just executes it. And he doesn't sidetrack himself. It comes across so realised and formally satisfying.
Yeah. It's an interesting choice to put your first collection out on this grand theme, I think. I mean, I asked him about that, actually. That conversation wasn't in the final interview, and he said that he had originally got two collections, and one was more of a collection in the sense of a lot of the work that he's had published over the years. So he had a collection, and he had this, which was a sort of a second collection, if you like. But he sent them both to Carcanet, and Michael Schmidt at Carcanet chose this one. I got the impression he was a bit surprised at that choice, but it's strong. I suppose themed collections do well, don't they?
Yeah.
My overall feeling at the end was I had a really strong sense of the tenderness of this relationship, and it was beautifully rendered. I think this sense of these two people, the partnership they had, what was lost. So
nothing mawkish about it. Nothing
not
that's kind
in
of
the slightest. No,
trying to be sentimental. It's kind of an unsentimental tenderness, which it can be very moving.
Yeah.
I like the poem Wedding in Limousin.
Yes, that's the final, the kind of afterword, the postscript.
And you talked about pretty much being gripped by that and just writing it down by hand. Yeah, I really like this poem. It's kind of, it feels it's just flowing out despite itself.
It has got this spontaneous feel, hasn't it? And quite rightly for the last poem, I think, that kind of launches himself into the swimming pool, launches himself away from all of this to everything else that's coming. And so
hey, a swallow just skimmed the pool, was off again. 6 in a row, a swallow for each year you've been gone. It's time to swim. There's something about getting back into life, acknowledging the past and it still being there, but skimming over, and now let's kind of get inside the water again and start swimming. Yeah, very deft and enjoyable end.
So that's Hard Drive by Paul Stephenson, published by Carcanet last year, 2023. Now, you've been reading the latest publication from someone who's been interviewed on Planet Poetry in the past, a friend of the poddy, haven't you, Peter?
Yeah, Charlotte Gann. She's got a new pamphlet just published by Mariscat.
Oh, I don't know Mariscat. Where are they based?
I think they're based in Edinburgh.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if you do this. You grab hold of a pamphlet and some of them are just flimsy and disposable and designed to be forgotten. But this is it's just really nicely produced. Even the paper is really good. It just feels like something of substance. I loved Charlotte's two books, Noir and The Girl Who Cried, which were from Happenstance. And in a way, although these poems are slightly different in tone, they're kind of longer poems, and they're sort of dealing with time she's had in London and looking again at the past. Thematically, they feel very connected and a continuation from where she's been. And just the title of the collection is Cargo. It's such an awesome word, isn't it? What a great name for a publication. That sense of being freighted with lots of stuff. I wanted to read a poem from it, which I think, rather than me burbling about it, just goes straight to Charlotte's words. This is the title poem, Cargo. What if it started with my young Danish great-grandmother, whose name I'll never know, who was, I have been told, banished back to Denmark after the tragic, suspicious death of her second daughter? Say she left these shores, and that was that, fate sealed. What if, in her leaving my child grandmother, the blow was dealt? My grandmother, of course, never recovered from losing her sister, from losing her mother. Locked away like an orphan in a book, in a red brick English boarding school, she grew up and pretended, I imagine, then passed her broken heart on to my mother, undercover, who put it away, locked in her chest and closed forever. When I came along, small number 5, what if my mother passed to me her broken heart, under cover? Keep this deathly dark, she didn't tell me. Keep it sealed. Learn from me. It needs to be carried. It's the greatest shame you can ever imagine. Now it's yours to hide and cart. Keep it quiet. Keep it dark, your broken heart. Mistake it for a host of other sharp conditions, circumstantial as your life unfolds. Soldier on and pass it on. Pass it on.
Oh gosh, it's quite sad, isn't it? The idea of the inescapability of something terrible that's happened to one's ancestors, that we carry it. We can't help, but that's just the way it happens, and you just have to suck it up. But that's how I read it anyway.
Yeah, it's sort of generational trauma in a way.
Yeah.
I've heard people talk about this in terms of, Holocaust survivors and their families, how, the psychological impact of horror has gone on through the generations and been expressed later on. But a lot of what Charlotte focuses on is the kind of the everydayness and the private hurt that is just there and really informs people's lives. And so many of the poems here talk about small incidents that are sort of deeply wounding, like opening yourself up to a comparative stranger who's then, next time you see them, not interested in talking to you. There's kind of slights and weird hurts that stand for so much more in your life. And she's got a very brilliant way of observing those things. She's made it her own. It's her trademark, I think. It's a really good compliment for a poet that you can read their work and think, only Charlotte could have written that. So, yeah, grab it, I'd say. Grab a copy of Cargo from Mariscat Press.
Excellent. What I've been reading is a book by Janet Sutherland. It's called The Messenger House, published by Shearsman. It's an extraordinary book. It's part memoir, part poetry, part travelogue. Basically, Janet inherited a family heirloom. So these were the journals of her great-great-grandfather, George, who travelled to Serbia and Hungary in the mid-19th century with a Mr. Gutch, who was a Queen's messenger for the Foreign Office. So his job was to convey these important messages to and from London and, Istanbul, or Constantinople as it was then, although Constantinople was considered far too dangerous for these Victorian English gentlemen to travel to. So they stopped in Serbia, at a town in Serbia, which was the location of the Messenger House of the title of the book. And when they got there, they sort of hung about for the couriers to arrive from Constantinople to take their messages and to deliver the ones that were going to go back to London. So couriers, basically. Of course, travelling in those days, it's funny because in some ways it reminded me very much of travelling now. He moans in his journals about, arriving at Calais and the boat has just sailed and they've got to somehow, wait another 24 hours, or passing through a customs point where the carpet bags would be emptied out yet again and gone through by these bored guards. So a lot of things were similar, but for the most part, these diaries, these journals are extraordinary. He tells everything from a perspective of a foreigner abroad, but it's written in a very open and fluid style. And as Janet notes at the beginning, he didn't write these for publication. They were his own memories, if you like.
Yeah.
But having said that, they are, in places, the language is incredibly poetic.
Yeah, George writes really well. I love the bits about food and the drink, because he always seems to be having cheeky sharpeners here and there,
Oh, yes.
sometimes at breakfast.
They'd sit back, then they'd have a smoke and all this. It would be passed around, and lots of lovely detail, wasn't it? So, but in parallel to his journeys, we also learn about Janet's own journey. So she and her wife Leslie traced the steps that George took all the way to Serbia. This was back in 2018, and undertook this journey while Janet was already showing signs of illness at that point. So the other journey that takes place in the book is hers from being diagnosed with cancer through treatment and through to remission. So we've got prose entries interspersed with poems, interspersed with letters and all sorts of other sort of ephemera that Janet includes, and a complete tranche of footnotes. You read this book, haven't you, Peter?
I'm halfway through it. 322 footnotes, which are very diverting. I'm a sucker for footnotes, so I do like that.
I really enjoyed it. To begin with, I thought, oh gosh, this is very dense. It's so much detail. But actually, I kind of got into it, and I really enjoyed the fact that you felt that you were living this history. I was there. You know, it wasn't like reading about the Victorians in a textbook. It feels like a labour of love.
Yeah.
Because at the beginning, Janet explains how these diaries, how these journals came into her possession. And clearly it's all tied up with her own memories of visiting her grandparents and that thing about when you're a child and there are objects, you know, on the shelf or in a cabinet and you've no idea what their history is or what significance they have, but they've been kept as precious objects. And you want to know what makes them precious. And also you want to know, I suppose, how that might illuminate your own life. You know, this is someone who was her relative, and I feel as if she's kind of reveling in these every detail because it's all part of the tapestry. You know, it's all kind of important. Every observation, it's quite compelling. It does sort of suck you in.
It's very ambitious, isn't it? Because you do have the strands of going on at different times, sort of side by side. But I like the way it enables the past to become the present, you know, because you're almost with Janet mulling through these things at the same time. And
yes.
And I think the way the poems work in it sounds probably quite pretentious, but each poem sort of somehow skewers through. And it is the little kind of button on there that's sort of semi-timeless in a way.
Yes, and they also provide these moments of reflection or of comment. You know, you read something quite shocking and then there might be a bit of space and just a little 3 or 4 line poem. And so on the page, it kind of brings in air and space. And for me, it felt like I had a chance to digest what I'd just been reading about, you know, all these dates and names and places. And then, hang on a minute, you know, what are we talking about here? These experiences. And I really like that. There's a lot of poetry in the prose, but I would have liked a few more of these poems. Yeah,
it was making me think of being like a David Bowie fan or something in the 70s, whereas because I've got very used to these immaculate little collections from Janet, which I absolutely adore.
Yes.
And then she's gone and changed and, you know, there's something different now.
The poems are still Janet, you know, there's still these beautiful sorts of jewels in there.
Yeah, sort of found poems as well, isn't there? There's a kind of
there's found poems. There's some sort of
kinds of stuff going on.
Facsimiles of old letters, invoices, and stuff that sometimes can be poetic in themselves. I have found it very moving.
Definitely, yeah.
It made me think about something that Anne Carson writes in her book Knox, which is history and elegy are akin. The word history comes from an ancient Greek verb meaning to ask. One who asks about things, about their dimensions, weight, location, moods, names, holiness, smell, is a historian. But the asking is not idle. It is when you are asking about something that you realise you yourself have survived it. And so you must carry it or fashion it into a thing that carries itself. That kind of goes back to Charlotte's book, that one, doesn't it? That quote.
Yeah.
But I just thought this idea of history and elegy being akin.
Well, the idea of, you know, writing something and surviving it also in the messenger house as well, that calm way in which Janet talks about her own illness and in the middle of this kind of historical loop that she was investigating.
Yes, historical loop. That's a good way of putting it. Should I read one of the poems from Janet's book?
Yeah.
This one's called Run Through. There's something about a railroad which passes through a village. No station to sanction its passing. Just an opening people slide through. A farmer might pause before driving on. His load at right angles to the rails. No barriers to this crossing. Just the train which passes slowly. The road little more than a track. Some tarmac, some stones, the fields behind him, and houses to the side, dishevelled, with dogs on long chains and scruffy chickens scratching earth, and open plots that run to the rails in disorder. He pauses, that farmer, sweats, rubs his head, and looks like my father, stripped to the waist, on his way home for supper, chaff stuck to his skin. Dust will adhere. The day darkens towards nightfall. Nothing is permanent. So we go onwards. The village broken open like a husk of corn, and all these sentences unfinished.
Yeah.
So I think that was written when she had arrived in Serbia.
I love that sense of just catching glimpses from trains and moving on, and that's the sentence is unfinished. That's you get little glimpses into lives, and then you're gone, and how all those possibilities and other lives and all those things you'll never see or understand properly, they're all gone.
Yeah.
A lovely poem. She writes, her poetry is among my favourite poetry being written in the country, really. Yeah, because I knew we were going to talk about the messenger house today, I discovered a new word today. It's called prosimetrum.
Oh, that's good.
And the plural is prosimetra, a poetic composition which exploits a combination of prosa, and verse, metrum. Apparently this term was first coined by someone called Hugh of Bologna in the early 12th century.
Doesn't sound like a very Italian name, does it? Hugh, Signor Hugh of Bologna.
Anyway, because it was on a Wikipedia page and it had a list of publications that it considered these prosimetrums.
Right.
And the earliest one was the Satyricon by Petronius, dating from the 1st century. There was also Boethius, the Consolation of Philosophy.
Oh, yes.
Which was around 524, or written around then. Many years ago, I wrote a thesis about this book, and I grew to despise it more and more as I was writing.
Oh dear.
But there's poor old Boethius. He's sort of high up and quite an important official, and then he fell out of favour and was banished to the edge of empire. Basically, he was just in this sort of grim, castle-y place and tortured to death.
Oh no, gosh.
So as he was being tortured, the story goes, he wrote The Consolation of Philosophy. And even though he was a Christian, which was one of the reasons that I think he fell out of favour, he was very much talking about this thing called Lady Philosophy, and this Lady Philosophy guiding him through all these terrible events. And he contrasts it with the Wheel of Fortune.
Oh, yes.
Which is an idea that, really permeated Western thought and was popularised in The Consolation of Philosophy.
So we're all kind of, we're governed by Fortune, who's very...
Fickle.
Yeah.
Yeah, because one moment you're at the top, being a member of the inner circle of an empire, larging it and swanking about, and then...
Yeah, and then you're banished.
The Wheel of Fortune was picked up by Dante, amongst other people. Actually, translators in England of The Consolation of Philosophy were Alfred the Great, Chaucer, Queen Elizabeth I.
Oh, really?
All kinds of people translated it. And It was one of the way ideas from Plato and Aristotle, which kind of had influenced Boethius, passed back into the West, because there was this period where people in the West lost touch with those thinkers.
Oh, yes. That's right. They sort of weren't available to them. I remember being told that. I couldn't work out why that was. There was this kind of dark age.
Well, we have the Arab countries to thank for that, because their philosophers had copies of those books. And so it was thanks to the Muslim countries that we were then re-educated in, sort of Greek philosophy and so on.
Huh. Interesting.
So anyway, yeah, then it made me think of La Vita Nuova, which is Dante, which was published in 1293, which collected some of his love sonnets and all about his gorgeous Beatrice that he first saw when he was 9, I think, crossing the Ponte Vecchio in Firenze.
Lovely, yeah.
And I read it when I was about 22, and I just left university, spent a month in Florence. So I went around reading La Vita Nuova. It's mainly about how fab Beatrice is in all her bazillion ways.
Although I think he did write it also to impress fellow poets, to show that he knew what he was doing, and because he was quite a young man when he wrote it, I think.
It's interesting that the word prosimetron was coined by somebody in Bologna in the 12th century. So maybe it was just a thing in Italy that you presented your poems with a kind of blurb around them.
Yeah, yeah.
But obviously it's, people are still reading La Vita Nuova today.
In universities.
Yeah.
It's not on Richard and Judy's book group list yet.
And another example, quick example, was In Parenthesis by David Jones, which was a sort of modernist classic published in 1937, which is a kind of giant war poem stroke prosy dialogue and snatches of speech and so on, all mixed together in this big splurge. So, yeah, prosimetrum is, I would consider the Messenger House to be one of those, but
right, yeah. Wow.
It's interesting that kind of tradition goes back to at least the 1st century BC.
There is nothing new.